August 26, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the village of Crécy in northern France, 9,000 weary English soldiers braced themselves against 30,000 of Europe's most elite knights. The French army appeared unstoppable, superior in number, armed with heavy cavalry and boasting the greatest nobility in Christendom. Confidence pulsed through their ranks like thunder. High-born lords even quarreled over who would earn the glory of slaying the English king. But within 4 hours, the battlefield would tell a different story. 1,500 French nobles would lie dead, princes, dukes, and kings among them. The English would lose just 40 men. In one afternoon, 5 centuries of armored dominance would collapse, undone by peasants wielding wood and string. Edward III of England had recently landed in Normandy with 15,000 men, pressing his claim to the French throne through his mother's lineage. His invasion wasn't a conquest, it was a message. He set fire to the north of France, burning villages, destroying crops, and looting cities in what was called a chevauchée, a raid designed to expose the French king's weakness. After ravaging Caen, Edward turned north toward the English-held port of Calais. But Philip VI of France was closing in fast. He had raised the mightiest host in Christendom, 35,000 men, including 12,000 armored cavalry. The flower of French aristocracy had gathered for what they believed would be the glorious annihilation of a ragged English army. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were knights, the tanks of their age. Each one weighed close to a ton when mounted, horse and armor combined. Raised for war since childhood, trained to fight before most peasants learned to read, their armor cost more than an entire village earned in a year. For 500 years, the thunder of their charge had decided the fate of kingdoms. Infantry existed to die under their hooves. Archers were nuisances, cowards fighting from afar. Real men fought sword to sword. But Edward III understood something the French did not. The age of the knight was ending. Outnumbered 3-1, exhausted from weeks of marching and short on supplies, he knew only strategy could save them. He had 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, peasants, criminals, and commoners, hardened by years of practice enforced by law. In England, every man was required to train with the longbow every Sunday after church. Failure to do so was punishable by fine or imprisonment. That single law had turned an entire generation of farmers into an army of snipers. The longbow was simple, 6 feet of yew, a bowstring of hemp or flax, but in the right hands it was devastating. A skilled archer could loose 12 arrows per minute, hitting targets 250 yards away. The pull weight was immense, up to 180 pounds. Archaeologists can still identify longbowmen by their warped skeletons, their left arms permanently elongated from years of strain. Edward chose his ground carefully. His army took position on a gentle slope outside Crécy, forcing the French to attack uphill. He arranged his men in 3 lines, with archers forming a V between them to create overlapping fields of fire. Then, in a move that stunned even his own nobles, he ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. For centuries, mounted combat had been a symbol of rank and honor, but Edward stripped that away. There would be no gallant charges today, only survival. As the English prepared for battle, the contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. On the French side, arrogance reigned. Nobles in gleaming armor rode proud, banners whipping in the wind, boasting of the riches they would claim. They saw themselves as gods descending upon mortals. Across the valley, Edward's men dug trenches, hammered stakes into the ground, and strung their bows beneath torchlight. Archers rubbed beeswax on strings to repel the rain. Every movement was calculated, precise, disciplined. By nightfall, the English were ready. Their king even served them meat and ale to steady their nerves. Meanwhile, the French arrived exhausted from their forced march, half-starved and soaked. Philip VI tried to halt his men to rest until morning, but his nobles would not wait. They looked across the field at the smaller English force and saw only an insult to their pride. They demanded to attack immediately, glory clouding their judgment. Then came the rain. A torrential downpour drenched both armies. The English archers calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the cords beneath their helmets to keep them dry. The French Genoese mercenaries, crossbowmen hired for a fortune, weren't so wise. Their bowstrings sagged from the wet, losing their power. When the storm cleared, the Genoese advanced to attack, unaware that the English bows were still at full strength. As thunder rumbled across the valley, 5,000 Genoese crossbowmen loosed their bolts. Most fell short. Then the English archers replied. 5,000 longbows released at once, a sound so sharp and violent that chroniclers described it as the tearing of heaven itself. Arrows darkened the sky. 60,000 shafts fell every minute. The Genoese had no shields. Their heavy pavises were left with the baggage train miles behind. Within minutes, they broke ranks and fled. But their retreat enraged the French lords behind them. Count d'Alençon roared, "Cut down this rabble blocking our way!" And they did. French knights charged forward, trampling and slaughtering their own mercenaries. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, crossbowmen dying beneath the hooves of their employers, while English arrows poured down upon both alike. It was madness. Pride had devoured reason, and in that madness, the age of the knight began to die. As the Genoese corpses piled high, 12,000 armored cavalry began their charge uphill. It was a wall of iron and muscle, a roaring storm of banners and blades. But the English archers were ready, their arrows planted in the earth before them for easy reach. They waited in silence until the horses entered range. Then the sky turned black again. What happened next would change warfare forever. If you love dark history, forgotten battles, and the moments that changed the world forever, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. Because in part 2, we'll witness how a blind king rode into death, how pride crushed an empire, and how a peasant's arrow ended 500 years of chivalry. The French charge shattered the air like thunder. 12,000 knights thundered uphill toward the English line, their banners whipping like serpents in the rain-heavy wind. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their horses, the clatter of hooves echoing like 1,000 drums. Each man carried a faith in steel, that armor and bloodline alone could conquer the world. But at Crécy, faith in flesh would meet faith in distance. The first wave struck disaster before it even reached the enemy. The mud was thick from rain, clinging to hooves, dragging them down. Stakes hidden beneath the grass impaled horses mid-gallop. As they screamed and fell, arrows rained from above. Shafts pierced gaps in armor, eyes, armpits, throats. Horses reared, men toppled, banners vanished into chaos. What was meant to be an unstoppable charge became a choking mass of bodies, men crushed under the weight of their dying mounts. Still, wave after wave came. Behind them, nobles shouted in fury, demanding to charge again and again, their pride stronger than reason. French knights hurled themselves uphill in suicidal splendor, only to be cut apart by the invisible storm. Chroniclers wrote that the dead fell so thick that one might walk from one end of the field to the other without touching the ground. Among them was Charles of Bohemia, the blind king. Old, proud, and unable to see a single flicker of the world before him, he asked to be led into battle. His knights tied their reins to his saddle, promising to ride together into glory. And so they charged, a ring of blind faith galloping into death. They were found later, all dead together, their horses still bound, the king's emblem of the sun glimmering dimly through the mud. Edward III watched from a windmill on the hilltop, calm and silent. When his young son, the 16-year-old Edward of Woodstock, later called the Black Prince, asked permission to join the fight, the king refused to intervene. "Let the boy earn his spurs today," he said, and the prince did. When the French broke through the line, the young heir led his men with steady courage, his armor dark with blood and soot. It was said he stood like a lion among hounds. Night fell, and still the French charged. Each assault weaker than the last, their fury turning to panic, their courage to confusion. Trumpets blared through darkness, horses screamed, and the rain returned, washing rivers of blood down the slope. By midnight, the battlefield was a graveyard. Knights drowning in mud, their armor dragging them down like anchors. The air smelled of iron, smoke, and decay. At dawn, the sun rose on silence. The English moved among the fallen, stripping armor, cutting throats of the wounded who still groaned beneath the corpses. In the pale light they counted the dead, 1,642 knights and nobles, including the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, and the flower of French chivalry. Among the English, 40 men. The scale of it defied belief. Europe trembled. The myth of the invincible knight was over. No longer would noble birth guarantee survival on the battlefield. Crécy proved that discipline, terrain, and innovation could crush prestige and armor alike. It was not just a victory, it was a funeral for an age. In the months that followed, poets mourned the fallen as martyrs of honor, while scholars whispered that the world had changed forever. Kings began to rethink their armies. No longer could cavalry alone rule the field. The longbow, wielded by peasants, had become the equalizer of empires. The English longbowmen returned home as legends, though most received little gold for their service. Their names were never recorded. But their arrows had carved a line through history, from the mud of Crécy to the dawn of modern warfare. They had slain the idea of divine nobility with nothing but skill, patience, and discipline. Edward III, once doubted and mocked, became the embodiment of English strategy and foresight. His son, the Black Prince, rose to become one of the most feared commanders in Europe, and France, humiliated and broken, would not recover for a generation. The 100 Years' War had truly begun. Yet among all who fought, it was not kings or knights who defined Crécy, but the common men in soaked leather and rags, their fingers bleeding, their backs aching, who drew, loosed, and drew again. They proved that power belonged not to the blood of nobility, but to the will of those who refused to bow. History remembers battles by dates and numbers, but the field of Crécy was more than that. It was a turning point where pride drowned in mud, and the future was born in the pull of a bowstring. The echo of that moment still lingers, in every rifle fired from afar, in every war fought by those once considered expendable. The spirit of Crécy was not one of conquest, but of transformation. A world of kings had learned that courage could wear rags and calloused hands. And in that transformation, medieval chivalry met its silent grave. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, the ones that reshaped history through courage, loss, and defiance, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe to Moonlight Stories, where forgotten battles breathe again and the echoes of the past find a voice once more. Because history isn't dead. It's waiting for someone to remember.